Humble widow buys old ranch, and what she sees in the lake changes everything. Dorothy Jenkins never imagined her 68 years of life would lead her to that desperate decision. After losing her husband and watching her savings drain away with medicine and medical bills, she spent the last $3,000 she had left buying an abandoned ranch in rural Tennessee. On the first morning in that place forgotten by the world, while walking through the back of the property toward the lake, she saw something that made her heart race. An elderly woman, hunched over at the water's edge, was drinking with her hands like a thirsty animal. Dorothy blinked several times, thinking she was seeing things. The woman wore a faded grey dress and a scarf on her head, and her bare feet touched the damp grass of the shore. When she realized she was being watched, the stranger stood up frightened and ran toward the woods, disappearing among the trees like a shadow. "Wait!" shouted Dorothy, trying to catch up to her. "Don't be afraid." But the woman had already vanished, leaving only wet footprints in the dirt and an unsettling silence. Dorothy stood there, her heart still racing, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. Could she be a homeless person? Someone with mental problems? Or just her imagination playing tricks after so much stress? She returned to the old house that was now hers, a wooden structure that creaked in the wind and had leaks in several rooms. The peeling walls and the smell of mold constantly reminded her of how her life had changed drastically. Just 6 months ago, she lived in a small but decent apartment on the outskirts of Nashville. Now she was there alone in a place nobody wanted. The real estate agent who sold her the ranch had been very clear about the low price. $3,000 for 10 acres of land was practically a gift, he had said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What he didn't mention were the rumors circulating in the nearest town, Clear Springs, 15 miles away. The locals avoided talking about that place, but she heard whispers in the bakery where she bought bread the day before. "That ranch is no good for anything," a white-haired lady had commented to her friend. "Ever since old Augustus left 15 years ago, strange things happened there." Dorothy didn't pay attention at the time. She was too desperate to care about rural superstitions. After her husband, Walter, passed away from a heart problem, she discovered the debts were larger than she had imagined. The apartment was sold to pay off the debts, and what was left barely covered a few months' rent elsewhere. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The ranch seemed to be her only option. At least there she would have a roof over her head and could try to grow something to survive. Not that she knew much about farming, but she was willing to learn. The alternative would be to depend on the goodwill of her children, who already had their own families and struggles. On that second morning, Dorothy woke up determined to explore the property better. The land was larger than she had imagined, with areas of abandoned pasture, some neglected fruit trees, and in the back that lake that intrigued her. It was a natural body of water fed by a stream coming from the nearby mountains. She walked cautiously toward the lake, hoping perhaps to see the mysterious woman again. The morning sun created golden reflections on the water's surface, and the place had a wild beauty that contrasted with the state of neglect of the rest of the property. There was the answer to one of her problems. She wouldn't have to worry about water shortage. That's when she noticed the footprints, not just at the edge of the lake, but forming a trail leading toward a wooden shed at the back of the property. The barefoot footprints were fresh in the damp earth, and Dorothy felt a shiver run down her spine. She followed the tracks carefully, stopping several times to listen. The only sounds were the birds singing and the distant murmur of the creek. The shed was a low building, with asbestos roof tiles and dark wooden walls. The door was closed but not locked. Dorothy hesitated. She had the right to be there, after all it was her property now, but something about the atmosphere of the place made her uneasy. She took a deep breath and pushed the door, which opened with a loud creak that echoed across the grounds. The inside was dark and smelled of dampness and something else, something she couldn't identify immediately. When her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Dorothy brought her hand to her mouth to stifle a cry of surprise. The shed wasn't empty as she had expected. On the contrary, it seemed like someone lived there. There was an old mattress on the floor, torn blankets piled in a corner, and leftover food scattered on plastic plates. On the wall, hanging from rusty nails, were old, faded women's clothes. But what caught her attention the most were the photographs, dozens of them, scattered on the floor and stuck to the walls. Old photos, some in black and white, others yellowed with time. In all of them appeared two people, a tall man with a mustache who she imagined was the previous owner, and a woman. Dorothy bent down to pick up one of the photos and felt her heart race again. The woman in the photograph was younger, but she was unmistakably the same person she had seen drinking water at the lake. The same face, the same eyes, the same sweet but melancholy expression. "My God," she murmured, looking around the shed with new understanding. "She lives here." The discovery brought more questions than answers. Who was that woman? Why did she live hidden in that shed? And what was her relationship with the previous owner of the farm? Dorothy collected some of the photos and left the shed, careful to leave everything as it was. Back at the house, she sat on the wooden porch, observing the surroundings and thinking about what to do. Her first reaction was fear. What if the woman was dangerous? What if she had serious mental problems? But there was something in her eyes in the photo and in the brief moment she saw her at the lake that didn't seem threatening. It seemed more sad, lost. The day passed slowly, with Dorothy trying to organize her few things in the house. She had brought only the essentials, some clothes, basic pots, a gas stove, and an air mattress. The rest she would have to improvise or get in town. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with orange hues, she decided to go back to the lake. She didn't quite know why, but she felt she needed to try to talk to the mysterious woman. She took with her a glass of water and some cookies she had bought in town. The lake was even more beautiful in the late afternoon, with the reflections of the sky creating a spectacle of colors on the surface. Dorothy sat on a large rock on the bank and waited, leaving the cookies and the glass beside her, clearly visible. She stayed there for almost an hour until darkness began to take over the place. She was about to give up when she heard a noise among the trees. She turned slowly and saw her. The woman was standing about 10 meters away, watching her cautiously. "I won't hurt you," Dorothy said softly, without getting up. "I just want to talk." The woman took a step back, ready to run away again. Dorothy pointed to the cookies and the glass of water. "I brought these for you. You must be hungry." For a moment that seemed like an eternity. The two women stared at each other in silence. Then very slowly the stranger began to approach. Every step was hesitant, as if she expected Dorothy to attack her at any moment. When she got close enough, Dorothy could see her better. The woman appeared to be around her age, perhaps a few years younger. Her face was too thin. Grey hair escaped from her scarf and her clothes were dirty and torn in places, but her eyes, though frightened, held a clear intelligence. The woman took the cookies with trembling hands and began eating voraciously, like someone who hadn't eaten properly in a long time. Dorothy felt her heart tighten. "What's your name?" she asked gently. The woman stopped chewing and looked at her suspiciously. For a moment, Dorothy thought she would speak, but then the stranger finished eating quickly, grabbed the glass of water, drank it all at once, and ran back into the woods. "Wait!" shouted Dorothy, but it was too late. That night, she could hardly sleep. The image of the hungry, frightened woman wouldn't leave her head. There was something deeply wrong with that situation, and she couldn't just ignore it. In the morning, she made a decision. She would find out who that woman was and why she lived that way. The first stop would be the town of Clear Springs. Someone there should know something about the former owner of the farm and about the mysterious woman. Dorothy caught the bus that passed on the main road twice a day, and in less than an hour was in the center of the small town. Clear Springs had that typical feel of a Tennessee country town. Cobblestone streets, old houses with porches, a central square with a church and bandstand, and everyone seeming to know everyone. Dorothy went straight to the bakery, from experience the best place to get information in small towns. "You're new around here," commented the bakery owner, a plump woman of about 50. "Are you visiting someone?" "Actually, I bought the farm from the late Augustus," said Dorothy, watching the woman's reaction. The baker's smile vanished immediately, and she looked around as if checking who else was listening. "That farm," she whispered. "But ma'am, that place—" "What's wrong with that place?" insisted Dorothy. The baker hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I don't like to speak ill of others, but ever since your Augustus passed, strange things happen there. Some people swear they've seen a woman walking around the property like a ghost." Dorothy felt her heart race. "A woman? What do you mean?" "No one really knows. Some say it's the spirit of Mrs. Eleanor, who lived there with your Augustus. Others think it's just imagination. You know how country folks are." "And who was this Mrs. Eleanor?" asked Dorothy, trying to sound casual. The baker lowered her voice even more. "Your Augustus's sister. They lived together forever, neither ever married. After he passed, she just disappeared. Some say she left for the state capital, others—" "Others what?" "Others think she never left there." Dorothy left the bakery with more questions than answers, but at least now she had a name. Eleanor. The woman by the lake wasn't a ghost. She was the former owner's sister, and for some reason was still hiding on the farm. She spent the rest of the day in town trying to get more information. At the pharmacy, the post office, the hardware store, always with the same result. People became uncomfortable when the subject was Augustus's farm, and no one seemed to know for sure what had happened to Eleanor. It was only in the late afternoon, while waiting for the bus back, that an elderly lady approached her at the stop. "You've been asking about Augustus's farm, haven't you?" said the old woman, looking around to make sure they were alone. "I have." "Did you know them?" "I did. Good people, both of them. Augustus was an honorable man and Eleanor was a saint. She took care of the house, her brother, and everyone in need." "What happened to her after her brother died?" The old woman sighed deeply. "That's a sad story, my dear, very sad." "Can you tell me?" The woman looked around again and leaned closer. "Augustus had another brother, Martin, a greedy man without scruples. When Augustus passed away, Martin showed up saying that Eleanor was sick in the head, that she couldn't take care of herself. He got some papers from a doctor in the capital and took her away." "Took her where?" "That's the strange part. He said he was going to admit her to a clinic, but later told everyone that she had left, that she didn't want to live here anymore. He sold the farm and disappeared with the money." Dorothy felt a chill in her stomach. "And no one saw Eleanor after that?" "No one. That's why some people think she—" The old woman didn't finish the sentence, but Dorothy understood. People thought Eleanor had died and that her spirit haunted the farm. But she knew the truth. Eleanor was alive, hidden, living like an animal on her own family's land. "Why are you telling me this?" asked Dorothy. "Because if Eleanor is still out there, as some say, she needs help. And perhaps you are the right person to help her." The bus arrived at that moment, and Dorothy got on with her head buzzing with thoughts. During the entire trip back to the farm, she tried to piece together the puzzle. Martin had stolen his sister's inheritance, probably forging documents that certified her mental incapacity. But something went wrong, and Eleanor managed to escape, returning to the only place she knew as home. For 15 years she had lived in hiding, afraid of being found by her criminal brother, surviving as best she could in the abandoned shed. The situation was even worse than Dorothy had imagined. That night, she returned to the lake with more food and an old blanket. She waited patiently until Eleanor appeared, still cautious, but a little less frightened than the day before. This time, she stayed a bit longer, eating slowly and watching Dorothy with curiosity. "Eleanor," Dorothy said softly, testing her reaction to the name. The woman stiffened immediately, ready to run. "It's all right," Dorothy reassured her. "I know who you are. I know what happened to you." Tears began to roll down Eleanor's dirty face, but she didn't run. It was as if, after 15 years of silence and loneliness, she had finally found someone who saw her as a human being. He said I was crazy," were the first words Eleanor uttered in a hoarse and trembling voice. "He said no one would believe me." "I believe you," said Dorothy, slowly extending her hand. "And I will help you." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Gaining Eleanor's complete trust wasn't easy. It took several nights of short conversations by the lake before she told the whole story. Dorothy discovered that the situation was even more complex and painful than she had imagined. Augustus and Eleanor had inherited the farm from their parents, along with a small fortune in money kept in the bank. The two siblings never married and lived a simple and happy life, taking care of the land and each other. Martin, the younger brother, had left town when he was young, seeking opportunities in the capital, and only showed up when he needed money. When Augustus began to fall ill, Martin started visiting the farm more often. He pressured his brother to sell the property and split the money, arguing that two old people couldn't take care of such a huge place. Augustus always refused, saying that land was the only home Eleanor had ever known. After Augustus passed away, Martin showed up at the farm with a group of men who introduced themselves as doctors. They examined Eleanor, asked strange questions, and in the end declared she suffered from dementia and couldn't live alone. It was a lie, of course, but the documents they produced looked legitimate. "They took me to a clinic in the capital," Eleanor recounted, her voice barely a whisper. "A horrible place, with truly sick people. They gave me medicine that made me dizzy, said I was confused, that my memories weren't real." "How did you manage to get out of there?" asked Dorothy. "A nurse. She saw I wasn't crazy like the other patients. She told me my brother had sold the farm and disappeared with the money. Said nobody would come looking for me, that I was completely alone in the world." Eleanor had managed to escape the clinic during a patient transfer. With no money, no documents, no one to turn to, she hitchhiked in trucks and buses until she made it back to Clear Springs. But when she reached the farm, she found a new family living there. I hid in the woods for days, watching. They seemed like good people, the new family. Had small children, a young mother. I couldn't show up and ruin their lives with my problems. That's how Eleanor began living like a ghost in her own land. During the day, she stayed hidden in the shed or the woods. At night, she fished in the lake, picked fruit from the trees, drank water from the creek. The family who bought the farm stayed only 2 years before moving to the city, claiming the place was too isolated. After that, several other people tried living there, but nobody stayed long. Eleanor always took care not to be seen, but sometimes someone noticed signs of her presence: footprints in the dirt, fruit missing from trees, small disturbances that fueled rumors about hauntings. "Why didn't you seek help?" asked Dorothy. "Why didn't you tell someone the truth?" "Who would believe me?" replied Eleanor, with a bitterness 15 years of solitude had carved into her voice. A woman with no documents, no family, who escaped from a psychiatric clinic. "My brother was well known in town, had money, knew important people, and I was just a confused old woman." Dorothy felt anger growing in her chest. The injustice of the situation was infuriating. Eleanor had lost everything: her home, her dignity, her identity, because of her unscrupulous brother's greed. And now she lived like an animal, on her own land, because she was afraid to seek justice. "This is going to change," Dorothy promised. "We'll solve this together." But Eleanor shook her head sadly. "It's too late. Martin's already sold everything. Too much time has passed, and look at me." She pointed to her torn clothes and unkempt appearance. "Who's going to believe I own anything?" Dorothy looked at the broken woman before her and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She wasn't going to let this injustice continue. Even if it was a difficult battle, even if the odds were slim, she would fight for Eleanor's rights. In the following days, Dorothy began developing a plan. First, she convinced Eleanor to leave the shed and move into the main house. It was a hard-fought battle. Eleanor was afraid of being seen, afraid Martin would discover where she was, afraid of causing trouble for her new friend. "You're the true owner of this place," Dorothy insisted. "I only bought what Martin had no right to sell. Legally, I might be trespassing on your property." "No," Eleanor replied, shaking her head. "You bought it in good faith. I won't take that from you too." "Then let's solve this together. But you're not going to keep living like an animal in the shed." It took a lot of patience to convince Eleanor to take a hot bath, put on clean clothes, and sleep in a real bed. 15 years of wild living had left deep marks on her psyche. She would wake up during the night, ready to run at the slightest noise. She ate quickly, as if someone might take her food away at any moment, and she always stayed near the doors, prepared to escape. But slowly, Dorothy managed to make Eleanor feel safe. She cooked simple, nutritious meals, helped Eleanor care for her hair and skin dried out by time outdoors, and most importantly, offered something Eleanor hadn't had for 15 years, human companionship and respect. "Why are you doing this for me?" Eleanor asked one night, as the two drank tea on the house porch. "Because it's the right thing to do," Dorothy answered simply. "And because I know what it's like to be alone in the world, with no one to turn to." It was true, after losing her husband, Dorothy had experienced a different but equally painful kind of loneliness. The feeling of being forgotten, of not mattering to anyone, that her life made no difference in the world. Seeing Eleanor in that situation awakened in her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. The next step was to begin investigating the sale documents. Dorothy went back to town several times, always with different excuses, to talk to people who might have information about the transaction between Martin and the previous buyers. At the county clerk's office, she discovered that the sale documentation had some irregularities. Eleanor's signature on the inheritance transfer papers didn't match other old signatures in the files. But the clerk, a nervous, middle-aged man, said that didn't prove anything. "Elderly people sometimes have tremors, handwriting changes," he explained, avoiding Dorothy's gaze. "Besides, the transfer was made a long time ago. Even if there were irregularities, the deadline to contest it has passed." Dorothy left the clerk's office with the feeling that the employee knew more than he was saying. There was something in his nervous attitude, in the way he avoided her eyes, that suggested complicity, or at least knowledge that something was wrong. The following week, she tried a different approach. She returned to town pretending to be a researcher interested in local history and looked for elderly people who might have known the family. That's how she met old Anthony, an 80-year-old man who had been a friend of Augustus. Augustus was an upright man, old Anthony said, sitting on the porch of his simple house, wouldn't hurt a fly, and took care of Eleanor as if she were his own daughter. When he got sick, he was very worried about what would happen to her. "And Martin?" Dorothy asked. Old Anthony's face closed off. "Martin was trouble since he was a boy. Always wanted to take advantage of everything, always thought the world owed him something. Augustus suffered a lot because of that. Do you think Martin would be capable of harming his sister?" Old Anthony hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "Look, Mum, I don't like to speak ill of anyone. But Martin, he was capable of anything to get money, and Eleanor was always very innocent, very trusting, easy to fool. Could you tell me where Martin is now?" "I have no idea. After he sold the farm, he disappeared from town. Some say he went to New York, others to Los Angeles. No one has heard from him since." Dorothy returned home with more pieces of the puzzle, but still without a clear solution. How to prove fraud in documents from 15 years ago? How to find a man who had disappeared without a trace? And even if I could prove everything, how could I restore Eleanor's rights after all this time? Meanwhile, the bond between the two women deepened. Eleanor began telling stories of life on the farm before the tragedy. She spoke fondly of her brother Augustus, of the abundant harvests, the animals they raised, the simple but happy life they led. Augustus always said this land had something special, Eleanor told her one afternoon as they walked the property. He said whoever lived here with love and respect would be rewarded by nature. Dorothy looked around and had to agree. Despite the neglect, there was a particular beauty to the place. The lake reflected the sky with crystal clarity. The fruit trees still produced even without care, and there was a peace in the air she hadn't felt in years. "Maybe he was right," Dorothy said. "Maybe this place brought us together for a reason." It was around this time that Dorothy began noticing changes in herself. The constant anxiety that had haunted her since her husband's death was fading. She slept better, felt calmer, more centered. Caring for Eleanor and fighting for justice had given new meaning to her life. Eleanor was changing too. Gradually, the frightened, wild woman who lived in the shed was giving way to the person she'd been before the tragedy. She was intelligent, had a sense of humor, and possessed a deep knowledge of plants and agriculture that impressed Dorothy. "You could teach so many people about living off the land," Dorothy remarked one morning after watching Eleanor identify various medicinal plants growing naturally on the property. "I learned everything from Augustus and our father," Eleanor replied with a sad smile. They said the land was our teacher, that we needed to learn to listen to what it taught us. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The women's piece was abruptly interrupted on a Thursday afternoon. Dorothy was in the garden she'd started planting when she heard a car approaching on the dirt road. Visitors were rare in that isolated place, and her first reaction was alarm. She ran to the house and found Eleanor hiding behind the living room curtain, watching through the window with a face pale with terror. "It's him," Eleanor whispered, trembling. "It's Martin." Dorothy looked out the window and saw a black car parked in front of the farm gate. A man in his 60s, well-dressed with greying hair and an arrogant expression, got out. Even from a distance, the resemblance to Eleanor was evident. "Hide," Dorothy said. "Go to the back bedroom and don't come out until I say so." Eleanor obeyed without argument, but Dorothy could see the panic in her eyes. 15 years of hidden life had left deep trauma, and her brother's mere presence made her regress to a frightened animal state. Dorothy took a deep breath, smoothed her dress and went to meet the man who had destroyed her friend's life. Martin was leaning against his car, smoking a cigarette and looking around with the expression of someone appraising property. "Good afternoon," Dorothy said, stopping a few yards away. "Good afternoon," Martin replied, tossing his cigarette on the ground and stepping on it. "You must be the new owner." "I am. Can I help you with something?" Martin smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, I'm here to clear up a problem. It seems someone's been spreading lies about me in town." Dorothy felt her heart race but kept her expression neutral. "I don't understand." "Someone's been asking about my sister, about the sale of this farm, things that happened a long time ago and don't concern anyone anymore." "And what does that have to do with me?" Martin took a step closer, and Dorothy could sense the threat in his posture. "I have reason to believe that person was you, and I want to make one thing very clear. My sister has been in a specialized clinic for 15 years. She suffers from severe dementia and is unable to care for herself. Any attempt to remove her from there would be a crime." "Interesting," said Dorothy, trying to keep her voice steady. "And where is this clinic?" "That's none of your business," replied Martin, his tone growing more aggressive. "What is your business is to stop asking questions about matters that don't concern you." "And if I don't stop?" Martin smiled again, a cold and calculating smile. "You seem like an intelligent person. I'm sure you'll understand it's better not to get into unnecessary trouble." With that, he returned to the car and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and a tense atmosphere in the air. Dorothy stood still where she was until the sound of the engine completely disappeared, then ran to find Eleanor. She found her friend curled up in the corner of the room, crying silently. "He knows," whispered Eleanor. "He knows I'm here. He's going to take me back to that horrible place." "No, he won't," said Dorothy, hugging her. "I won't let him." But internally, she was terrified. Martin had clearly discovered her investigations and had come to intimidate her. Worse yet, he confirmed that Eleanor was officially committed somewhere. This meant that legally she was committing a crime by hiding a psychiatric patient. That night, the two women barely slept. Eleanor was terrified of being found, and Dorothy tried to think of a solution. In the morning, she made a risky decision. She would confront the system head-on. Her first step was to find a lawyer in Nashville. She took the bus to the capital, carrying all the photographs she had found in the shed, along with notes about the irregularities she discovered at the records office. The law firm she chose was small, but had a good reputation. The lawyer, Dr. William Parker, was a 40-year-old man specializing in family and estate law. Dorothy told the whole story, showing the evidence she had collected. Dr. William listened carefully, asking specific questions and examining the photographs. When she finished, he sighed deeply. "Mrs. Dorothy, I'll be honest with you. This is a very complicated case. After 15 years, proving document fraud will be extremely difficult, and the fact that your friend is officially committed complicates things even more." "But she's not crazy," insisted Dorothy. "I've talked with her for weeks. She's perfectly lucid." "I believe you, but legally that doesn't matter. If there's a medical report attesting to mental incapacity, and if she's in the custody of an institution, taking her out without authorization constitutes a crime. So there's nothing we can do? Dr. William thought for a moment. There is, but it will be a long and difficult battle. First, we need to get an independent psychiatric evaluation of your friend. If she's deemed capable, we can file for a reversal of guardianship. Then, we investigate the original sale documentation for evidence of fraud. And how long would that take? Months, maybe years, and there's no guarantee of success. Dorothy left the office discouraged, but not defeated. She had faced difficulties before and knew that the most important battles were rarely easy. She returned to the farm determined to fight to the end. She found Eleanor working in the garden, an activity that helped her control her anxiety. In recent days, she had dedicated herself to cultivation with a passion that impressed Dorothy. The plants responded to her care in an almost magical way, growing lush and healthy. "How was it in the city?" asked Eleanor, without looking up from the seedlings. "Tough but not impossible," replied Dorothy, telling about the conversation with the lawyer. Eleanor listened quietly, her hands continuing to work the soil with steady, precise movements. "I don't want you spending your money on me," she said finally. "You've already done far more than I deserved." "It's not about deserving," answered Dorothy. "It's about justice and about friendship." That week, the two women developed a routine that helped them cope with the stress of the situation. They woke up early, tended the garden and the animals they had started raising, some chickens and a pig that Dorothy had bought in the city. In the afternoon, Eleanor taught about medicinal plants, while Dorothy handled the paperwork and correspondence with the lawyer. It was during one of these afternoons that they received an unexpected visit. A young woman, about 30 years old, appeared at the farm gate. She was well dressed, wore glasses, and carried a document case. "Good afternoon," she said when Dorothy answered. "My name is Margaret Johnson. I'm a social worker from the municipal department. I received a complaint about a person living irregularly on this property." Dorothy felt her blood run cold. Martin had made good on his threat. "I don't understand," she said, trying to buy time. "According to the complaint, there's a woman with mental issues living here without proper medical supervision. I need to verify the situation. And if I don't allow it? Then I'll have to return with a court officer and a court order." Dorothy looked back and saw Eleanor hidden in the shadow of the porch, listening to the whole conversation. The look of terror on her friend's face broke her heart. "May I see your documents?" asked Dorothy. Margaret showed her identification, which seemed legitimate. Dorothy realized she had no choice. "She's here," she admitted, "but it's not what you're thinking." Margaret entered the property, and Dorothy led her to where Eleanor was. The social worker looked the elderly woman over with a professional eye, noting her well-kept appearance and the clarity in her eyes. "Ma'am, what is your name?" asked Margaret gently. "Eleanor," she replied, her voice trembling. "Eleanor what?" "Eleanor Mitchell Jenkins." Margaret made notes and continued with basic questions. Date of birth, parents' names, previous address. Eleanor answered everything correctly, without hesitation. "Ma'am, do you know what day it is today?" "Thursday, March 23rd. "And who is the President of America?" Eleanor had correctly answered this and several other questions. It was clear there was nothing wrong with her mental capacity. "Mrs. Eleanor," said Margaret finally, "according to official records, you've been in a psychiatric clinic for 15 years. How do you explain being here?" It was then that Eleanor told her story. She spoke of the forced commitment, the escape, the years living in hiding. Margaret listened with growing attention, taking detailed notes. "This is a very irregular situation," she said when Eleanor finished. "I'll need to verify these records and contact the proper authorities." "Is she going to be taken away?" asked Dorothy. "Not for now, but I'll need to make a full report, and you're going to need legal assistance." Margaret left, promising to return in a few days with more information. Dorothy and Eleanor stood embracing on the porch, knowing their time of peace was over. That night, they talked about what to do. Eleanor was inclined to run again, to disappear into the woods before the authorities returned. But Dorothy convinced her it was time to fight. "You haven't done anything wrong," she said. You're the victim here. Running will only make you look guilty. But what if they take me back to that place? They won't. I won't let them. The next morning, Dorothy did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She called her children. She phoned Richard, the eldest, who lived in New York, and Catherine, who was in Los Angeles. She explained the situation, asked for help, admitted she needed them. Their reaction was surprise, then concern. They promised to come to the farm over the weekend to help resolve the situation. For the first time in months, Dorothy felt less alone. Richard arrived Saturday morning driving a rental car. He was a 45-year-old engineer with the same determination as his mother. Catherine arrived in the afternoon by bus, carrying a suitcase full of research she'd done on psychiatric patients' rights. Both were shocked by Eleanor's story, but mostly impressed by their mother's transformation. Dorothy, who had been depressed and lost since her father's death, was now energized with a clear purpose. "Mum, are you sure you want to get involved in this?" asked Richard. "It could be a very complicated battle." "I'm sure," Dorothy replied. "It's the first time in years I feel like I'm doing something important." Catherine, who was a journalist, proposed a different strategy. "What if we make this public?" she suggested. "A story like this has potential to attract media attention. Public pressure might be more effective than a legal battle." They spent the weekend planning. Richard used his contacts to find a lawyer specializing in human rights. Catherine began preparing press materials, and Dorothy organized all the documentation and evidence she'd collected. Eleanor watched everything with a mixture of hope and fear. After 15 years in hiding, the idea of public exposure terrified her. But the presence of Dorothy's family, the affection and respect with which they treated her, began restoring her faith in human nature. "You don't know me," she told Richard and Catherine. "Why are you doing this for me?" "Because our mother believes in you," Catherine replied simply, "and she's always been good at judging people's character." On Monday, Margaret returned as promised, bringing disturbing information. She'd managed to contact the clinic where Eleanor was supposedly hospitalized. According to the institution's records, she had escaped 3 months earlier and was being sought. 3 months? Asked Dorothy. "But she's been here for 15 years. According to them, she was there until recently. There are medical records, prescribed medications, everything documented." Eleanor turned pale. "That's a lie," she whispered. "I never went back there, never." Margaret showed the documents she'd brought. There were detailed medical records, signatures supposedly from Eleanor, behavior reports. All very well forged, but convincing to anyone who didn't know the truth. "Someone is maintaining these fake records," said Richard, examining the papers. "Probably receiving government money to care for a patient who doesn't exist. Or who exists but isn't there," added Catherine. The situation became even more complicated when a police car arrived at the farm. 2 officers got out, accompanied by a man in a suit who introduced himself as Dr. Mitchell, director of the psychiatric clinic. "We've come for our patient," announced the doctor. "Eleanor Jenkins escaped our institution and needs to return to continue treatment." "She didn't escape from anywhere," Dorothy countered. "She's been here for 15 years. "That's impossible," said Dr. Mitchell, showing the records. "We have complete documentation of her stay at our clinic." Eleanor hid behind Dorothy, trembling with fear. The police presence made her relive the trauma of her forced hospitalization. "I won't go," she whispered. "I'd rather die than go back there." That's when Catherine had a brilliant idea. "Doctor." "Mitchell," she said, picking up her cell phone. "Does your clinic have security cameras?" "Of course." "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm calling a journalist colleague right now. He can be at your clinic in an hour to check the recordings from the last 3 months. If Eleanor was really there, she should appear in the footage." The doctor hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. That won't be necessary. We have the medical records." "But the footage would be definitive proof, wouldn't it?" insisted Catherine, dialing a number. Dr. Mitchell exchanged nervous glances with the police officers. I need to check some details before proceeding," he said finally. "Perhaps it's best to postpone this for a few days." "What details?" asked Richard. Administrative matters, protocols that need to be followed. The police officers, sensing something wasn't right, decided not to push the situation. They left with the doctor but made it clear they would return. "They're hiding something," said Catherine after they left. "No legitimate clinic would have a problem showing security records." That night, Dorothy made a decision that would change everything. She called Dr. William, the lawyer she had consulted, and asked him to file a lawsuit challenging Eleanor's hospitalization. She also authorized Catherine to contact the press. "Let's make this public," she said. "If there's corruption involved, sunlight is the best disinfectant." The first report about the case came out 3 days later in a local newspaper. The headline read, "Woman lives hidden on farm after escaping forced hospitalization." The article told Eleanor's story, the irregularities in the farm sale documentation, and the suspicions about the psychiatric clinic. The impact was immediate. Dorothy's phone wouldn't stop ringing with journalists wanting more details. Human rights lawyers offered pro bono help, and, most importantly, other people began coming forward with similar stories about Dr. Mitchell's clinic. A woman from Nashville recounted how her mother had been hospitalized at the same clinic against her will after a greedy relative claimed mental incapacity. A man reported suspicions about his uncle's disappearance, who had also been hospitalized by a brother interested in the inheritance. Within a week, the case gained national attention. Television programs sent crews to interview Dorothy and Eleanor. The story deeply touched the public, especially elderly women who identified with Eleanor's vulnerability. Martin tried to react, giving interviews where he claimed his sister was truly mentally ill and that her escape put her and others at risk. But his version had obvious holes, and each public appearance only increased suspicion about his motives. The turning point came when a former clinic employee approached Catherine with explosive information. John Charles, a nurse who had been fired for questioning irregular practices, brought documents proving the existence of phantom patients. The clinic received government money to care for at least 20 people who didn't exist or weren't there, revealed John Charles. "I tried to report it, but I was threatened and fired." With this evidence, the state attorney's office opened an official investigation. The clinic was raided by police, who found falsified records, expired medications, and deplorable conditions for the actual patients. Dr. Mitchell was arrested along with several accomplices, including the county clerk, who had facilitated fraudulent documentation. The investigation uncovered a corruption network involving document forgery, inheritance appropriation, and elder abuse. Martin was also detained while trying to leave the country. Documents found in his car proved his involvement in the scheme from the beginning. He had used the money from the sale of the farm to pay for his sister's fake hospitalization, ensuring she could never claim her rights. The trial became a landmark in the fight for elderly rights in America. Martin was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud, document forgery, and unlawful imprisonment. Dr. Mitchell got 15 years, and all his wealth was seized to compensate the victims. For Eleanor, the legal victory was just the beginning of a new life. With the help of psychologists and social workers, she started readjusting to life in society. The 15 years of isolation had left their marks, but her gentle and intelligent essence remained intact. The farm was officially returned to her, but Eleanor insisted on sharing the property with Dorothy. "You saved me," she said. "This land is ours now." Together, they transformed the farm into an innovative project. Using Eleanor's knowledge of agriculture and medicinal plants, they created an organic farm that became a reference in the region. They also opened a shelter for elderly women in vulnerable situations. The story gained international dimensions when it was adapted into a documentary that competed in film festivals. Dorothy and Eleanor became symbols of the fight against elder abandonment and abuse, being invited to speak at conferences and seminars. But for them, the most important thing was the family they had built. Richard and Catherine started visiting the farm regularly, bringing their grandchildren. Other relatives of Eleanor, who had believed her lost forever, reappeared in her life. One afternoon, 5 years after their first meeting at the lake, the two friends were sitting on the porch watching the children play in the yard. The house had been renovated, the vegetable garden was lush, and the lake reflected a cloudless sky. "Do you think Augustus would be proud?" asked Eleanor. I'm sure he would, replied Dorothy. He always said this land would reward those who lived here with love. And he was right. Just look at what has grown here. Dorothy looked around and smiled. It wasn't just about the plants and buildings. It was about the lives that had flourished, the wounds that had healed, the justice that had prevailed. The lake, which had once been a scene of despair and loneliness, was now a meeting point for a chosen family. Children ran along its banks, women found refuge in its clear waters, and two friends contemplated the reflection of a future that almost didn't happen. Dorothy, said Eleanor, taking her friend's hand. Yes? Thank you for not running away when you saw me at the lake. Thank you for giving me a reason to stay. The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. Somewhere in the house, someone started preparing dinner. Voices and laughter echoed across the property, creating a symphony of life and hope. Dorothy thought of the desperate woman who had arrived at that place 3 years earlier, with only $3,000 and a broken heart. Now, at 71 years old, she finally understood what it meant to have a full life. The mystery of the lake had revealed itself not as a supernatural apparition, but as the most precious discovery of all. Proof that it's never too late to find family, purpose, and love. And when the stars began to appear in the dark sky, reflecting on the calm surface of the lake, the two women knew they had found exactly what they had been looking for their whole lives, even without knowing they were searching. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave your sincere words in the comments. Do you believe Dorothy made the right decision by helping Eleanor? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. End of story.